Coming up, lessons from the First World War.
The world commemorates the beginning of World War I with the hope of learning from history and the sense that it is a moment to reaffirm universal principles of human rights and justice.
From Carnegie Council's symposium in Sarajevo, speakers examine mistakes of the past and discuss how we can move toward a more peaceful future. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
I'm Haris Romic. As a Carnegie Council trustee and a native of Sarajevo, Bosnia, I'd like to welcome you to this special edition of Carnegie Council's Global Ethics Forum. On June 27, 2014, Carnegie Council held a symposium in Sarajevo, commemorating the 100th anniversary of the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, which helped ignite the First World War. 1914 is also the year Carnegie Council was founded. The convergence of these anniversaries offered a unique opportunity to examine the topics of war, peace, and reconciliation. The distinguished speakers highlighted in this television program looked at the lessons we learned from the First World War. Of particular interest is how they all come to different conclusions while keeping the same goal in mind: fostering sustainable peace through inclusive discussion and ethical reflection. Carnegie Council President Joe Rosenthal's opening remarks present this 100-year perspective as an opportunity to imagine a transcendent story. He considers competing claims of war guilt and victimhood from a fresh perspective, as he suggests they may best be understood as a part of a larger project in which seeking a pluralistic global ethic points humanity in the direction of a more positive future.
We arrive with as many questions as answers. However, one thing we have learned over the past 100 years is that a simplistic notion of peace is not enough. Peace cannot be established by rational plan, followed by force of will, in a simple belief in the unity of mankind under a global ethic. That is naive and wishful thinking. There is another dimension to consider. Let's call it the human dimension, the ethical dimension. This dimension involves power, interests, competing values, and human imperfections. A 100-year perspective gives us the opportunity to reflect on the ethical principles that are deeply rooted in this particular place, and yet speak to us in universal human terms. So please allow me to briefly suggest 3 principles, all very much human, alive, and in contest here in Sarajevo and around the world. First, there is the idea and ideal of pluralism, living together with differences. For centuries, Sarajevo has been a place of tolerance. Ethnic and religious minorities have lived in harmony. The Olympic Games of 1984 were to be the crowning moment of recognition, a fitting symbol of achievement for 20th century European civilization, and indeed the world. The fact that it came apart in the 1990s does not negate the ideal. We can and should remember the success of years gone by and rededicate ourselves to the values that prevailed for centuries before. A second idea to consider in light of Sarajevo 1914 is the principle of self-determination. Self-determination, unleashed in earnest 100 years ago, remains the bedrock idea of international law and ethics. Once released, the principle of self-determination became difficult for political leaders to harness. Self-determination became the great variable of the 20th century, and we still live with the consequences. While self-determination may be the rock that we stand on as the foundation for freedom and human flourishing, this single principle does not give us the full picture of the landscape. Ethnic groups live amidst each other. Territories are not clearly defined or aligned by ethnic and cultural boundaries. Great powers have their spheres of influence. Empires collapse or become reconstituted in new forms. Instability arises. Border regions are contested. Our distinguished panelists have spent their lives trying to understand this. This occasion gives them a moment to reflect and share what they have learned. The third idea that concerns us today is the power of history and memory. For all of the local history, and there are many colorful, glorious, and painful layers of it, the world commemorates the beginning of World War I with the hope of learning from history and a sense that it is a moment to reaffirm universal principles of human rights and justice.
Also recalling both history and memory is author and academic Margaret McMillan, whose keynote presentation seeks to answer an often debated question: was World War I inevitable? Professor McMillan quotes British journalist Norman Angell, who famously wrote in his 1909 book, The Great Illusion, "Governments are literally crazy if they think they can make war and get any benefit out of it. They won't. They will spend down their own resources, and they will find that if they do conquer another piece of territory, they will conquer a piece of territory that has been so exhausted and so damaged by war that it won't pay." By comparing various driving forces and assumed trajectories against the historical record, Professor McMillan presents both sides of the debate over the inevitability of the Great War.
What I think is very striking in the period before 1914 is how many Europeans assumed that this would go on, that there would in fact continue to be peace and prosperity and progress. Not that many people in 1914 expected a major war. There were certainly some who feared it and some who worked against it. But I think the general feeling in the summer of 1914 was that Europe had come through some rather rough periods. There had, as you would all know better than me, been 2 wars in the Balkans in 1912 and 1913, which had led many people to talk of the possibility of a general war, but it hadn't happened. And so at the beginning of 1914, the British Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, said that the international horizon looked calmer than it has been for many years, and we had every reason to think that we were now entering a period of continued calm and, again, continued progress and prosperity. The pressures in Europe towards both war and peace are things that we need to look at. And I think what we have to remember that just as there were pressures towards war, there were also very, very strong pressures towards peace. Before I do that, I'd like to talk just about some of the ways in which changes in European society were affecting the relationships of people, both to their own societies, to other societies, and towards war and towards peace. We have to remember that this was a period in which Europeans moved from being members of relatively isolated and detached communities to being parts of greater units, whether they were nations or empires. And this is partly a result of modern communications, a tremendous spread of literacy, spread of things like the mass media, and people simply, because they were more prosperous, had more time to notice what was going on in their own societies. There had also been, and this affected pretty much the whole of Europe, a very significant shift in the relationship between peoples and their own societies, which I think certainly goes back to the French Revolution. And that is that people increasingly no longer saw themselves or were seen by their rulers as subjects. In other words, increasingly they saw themselves as citizens, as members of a polity, as members of an organization, to which they had obligations. They had obligations to support that society, and that could mean supporting it in peace, but it could also mean supporting it in war. They also had an expectation, or there was an expectation on the part of those in charge, that citizens would see themselves as part of this greater unit, greater society. And so you have a sense that citizens both have a stake in their society. Increasingly, they're able to vote for their own rulers. There's a very significant spread of the franchise, again, throughout Europe in the course of the 19th century. More and more people are voting, even in countries such as Russia, which were generally regarded as being slightly behind the development of the rest of Europe. By 1914, there were well-rooted local assemblies, the Zemstvo, but also a Duma, for which, again, the franchise was extending. And so you see in the course of the 19th century a new relationship between people and their rulers, a sense of mutual responsibility and mutual obligation. Now, that could lead to a greater involvement of the public in war, and did in some countries. Increasingly, people took an interest in what their countries were doing, felt an obligation to come to its defense. On the other hand, that change in the relationship between citizens and their rulers, or between peoples and their rulers, could have another outcome, and was having another outcome, that as citizens became increasingly involved, they also felt an obligation to prevent their countries from doing things that were stupid or dangerous. And so citizens felt increasingly that they had a right to criticize what their governments were up to. And often that criticism was that the government was behaving recklessly, that the government was risking war, that the government was threatening to damage both its own society and other societies. And so obligations to your larger community didn't necessarily lead to supporting it in war. It could also lead to supporting it in peace. And there was a very interesting development in the course of the 19th century, which was that the sense of being a citizen, of having an obligation to whatever structure you were part of, was increasingly extended beyond national boundaries. And so increasingly in the 19th century, you got people saying we have an obligation not just to our own particular set of rulers, we have an obligation to humanity. And you begin to get a sense that we are all somehow part of a much wider organism and that we have a responsibility to that. And that fed into what was a very active peace movement. I think what we have to remember always about the 19th century and about the period just before 1914, that there were many forces at play in Europe and in the world. And again, I think we have to warn ourselves against looking at war as something that was inevitable, that it was bound to happen, that it was just waiting to happen. Europe was very much a continent in play in 1914, and I think it could have gone in any number of directions. I think it's fair to say that for many Europeans in the summer of 1914, war was either impossible or improbable. It was just not something that they did anymore. There wasn't any purpose in doing it. I think you also got a sense, which came partly from Darwinian ideas, that human species was evolving. Now, Darwin's ideas as applied to human societies were mixed blessing because they could trend either towards war or towards peace. What also comes into play in the summer of 1914 is fear. Fear both of their own peoples, fear that their peoples won't fight, but a fear of what the other might do. And this, again, I think is something we need to remember, that you have to do your best to try and understand the other side. You have to do your best to keep in communication with them. You have to make sure that your assumptions are grounded. So often in international relations, we assume the other side is thinking in certain ways, behaving in certain ways. We don't do enough to find out. The real fear in Germany, among the military, for example, that if they didn't fight Russia in 1914, they would not be able to fight it by 1917, that Russia was getting so strong. It didn't, I think, make them deliberately bring about a war, but it made them think that if we've got to have a war, this is the time to do it. In the end, I think the war broke out because people made stupid assumptions. They acted hastily, they acted for reasons which were not particularly rational, and they acted without attempting, I think, to think of other alternatives. The key moments, I think, were when Austria-Hungary decided that this time it had the perfect opportunity to destroy Serbia, or at least bring it under control, and then Germany decided to back Austria-Hungary. But the situation, the setting for the catastrophe was set much further. I think peace was still possible until very late in July 1914. And if there's one final lesson I'd like to suggest we all try and remember, is that we don't give up. It's not easy to work for peace. It can be a very hard slog, but I think very important not to give up, not to throw up our hands and say, nothing we can do.
Working for sustainable peace is indeed not easy. Carnegie Council Senior Fellow George Rupp says religion can also play an inescapable role in generating underlying hostilities. However, as you're about to see, this former International Rescue Committee president focuses on the critical yet less evident role religions play in resolving the issues at the core of conflict, finding reconciliation.
The poignant fact that we are observing the centennial of what now is the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs in the same year as we are commemorating the centennial of the start of World War I dramatically accentuates the reality that such efforts are all too often unsuccessful, especially if the only measure of success is the complete avoidance of war. But the dual centennial also can serve to focus our collective attention on the challenge of continuing to pursue the crucial goal that Andrew Carnegie set for all of us. To frame that goal in general terms, it is to foster inclusive communities, communities that are capable of incorporating significant differences within a single unified framework. The goal affirms the value of particular commitments. It does not seek to reduce beliefs and practices to a least common denominator, because its aim is to be inclusive, rather than to seek what in the end attempts to be a single set of universal and all-encompassing affirmations. The goal of inclusive communities is crucial as a counterweight to the presumption that the default position for allowing multi-ethnic and multi-religious political arrangements is what we value in the West as secular individualism. In contrast to every insistence that individuals must not allow religious convictions to shape their political positions, inclusive communities seek to incorporate more particular commitments into their institutional structures. Any such more particular commitments cannot simply be asserted as universal and therefore as appropriately imposed on everyone. Instead, public policies must be based on appeals to authorities that are in principle accessible to all citizens. While invoking religious convictions is not ruled out, any such appeals must also be open to public appraisal. To build such inclusive communities is an enormous challenge at a time when all of us are aware of others who have quite different beliefs and practices from our own. To pursue that challenge, we must continue on the course that Andrew Carnegie set a century ago. There's a long way to go before religious communities become more of a resource for reducing rather than a source for increasing antagonism. But to move in that direction clearly requires greater understanding at the local level. Only such local understanding can provide a solid foundation, developing larger and more inclusive and more representative international networks so that religious communities can indeed become a resource for mitigation of violence and even for conflict resolution. Despite the fact that it has, in the past 2 decades, become less diverse, Sarajevo has the potential to be a model for multi-ethnic, multi-religious community that is indispensable to reconciliation worldwide. With a history of this city as a location both for peaceful coexistence and for fierce antagonism and violence, Sarajevo can become, or better, be once more, a beacon of hope for the larger world. I urge all citizens of this great city to seize the opportunity and to work to allow Sarajevo to become a global leader in the cause of fashioning inclusive communities.
Sarajevo's volatile history of both peaceful coexistence and fierce violence is a dichotomy found throughout the Balkans. Croatian historian and Yale professor Ivo Banac presents a deeper analysis of a former Yugoslavia. He describes the search for a solution in a place so fragmented that the name of the region has become synonymous with internal state division. He addresses 2 questions. Which remedy can reduce the Balkanization of the Balkans? And should that be our goal?
One remedy is the regime of restrictions. Not only are certain signs and symbols consistently criminalized, but whole fields of inquiry are closed to examination in favor of certain politically correct narratives that are officially promoted and perpetuated. The communist regimes, in their initial phases, practiced this remedy with various degrees of consistency, but the intrinsic weakness of their approach was that the enemies acquired political coloration that was effectively identical to the old nationalist stereotypes. If the only Italians that you encounter in primary school texts are all brutish fascists who deserve to be destroyed, then the mental image of Italians will remain negative and only to a degree at variance with the 19th century fictions on age-old Venetian depredations and such. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, especially, the communist-era images of Ottoman tyranny, which were uncritically accepted from the old nationalist regimes, were inevitably transferred to the whole Muslim community. The vaunted slogan of brotherhood and unity rang hollow in the context of constant reminders of Muslim perfidy, enforced not by vulgar propaganda, but by the most distinguished national classics. The preferred remedies of the post-communist period have been educational schemes and participatory measures that have met with limited success. Unlike the accomplishments of the joint German-Polish Textbook Commission, which devised mutually acceptable historical textbooks for the use in both countries, in Poland and in Germany, the dominant narrative in the school textbooks, especially in history and civic education, has changed only to a small degree in the Balkan countries after the fall of communism and the harsh nationalist regimes of the 1990s. The deplorable situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina is made worse by the ethnic interpretations of history in the areas of dominant regional majorities. I must say, not only in Republika Srpska, but also in the Federation. There are many cases of actual apartheid education in the same school district, with children being educated in a uninational setting in shifts within the same school building. Still, the most critical systemic omission, notably in Bosnia and Herzegovina, is the absence of a method that would protect the right of individuals to make claims against their territorial governments, something that was present in the European judiciary practices really since the Osnabrück Treaty of 1648. Finally, one cannot overlook the political actions of leaders of states. During the past decade, important symbolic actions were pursued by the regional heads of state or prime ministers in atonement for the misdeeds and crimes of their co-nationals or predecessors. Though stiffly choreographed and frequently awkward in content, it cannot be claimed that these actions were entirely futile. They reinforce, however, the growing culture of memory that, in the opinion of many, is the basic prerequisite in the prevention of conflict. But there is another approach. Ivo Banac, who was more responsible than most distinguished authors in perpetuating negative national stereotypes and conflicted modes of interpretation of Balkan history, at the end of his life, opted for a slightly different way. I quote, "Not death, but forgetting resolves everything. Forgetting, moreover, not only of concepts, words, and faces, but of everything that exists and lives. The forgetting of body and the forgetting of time. Forgetting in order to catch one's breath and continue to live in body without memory, with spirit without name. Forgetting, which is death with the right to hope." But how can one, even under these terms, forget in Sarajevo, particularly on this anniversary?
Forgetting is difficult not only in Sarajevo, but in any post-conflict setting. In fact, forgetting gross transgressions of violent episodes in human history would be unethical. In Carnegie Council Senior Fellow David Rodin's comments on ethics in war, he explores the other side, remembering, and how it can be a catalyst for progress.
How can there be such a thing as ethics in war? It does seem to many people like an oxymoron, but not, I think, if we understand ethics and the activity of ethics as the activity of making judgment. And I think that we cannot but escape making judgments about right and wrong within war. And we have to remember that to condemn activities like terrorism, like indiscriminate action, like the killing of civilians, is to make an ethical judgment. And then in that sense, there not only can be ethics of war and ethics in war, but it has to be the beginning point. Somebody who has made his career in philosophy is very much committed to the endeavor of thinking, and to the possibility that by thinking about hard problems in a way that is honest and rigorous and pursued to the best of our abilities can be a very powerful way of making progress. But the important thing for me is that that process of thinking can sometimes lead to very, very powerful dreams. I want to use an example of Immanuel Kant. So Immanuel Kant famously published a pamphlet called Perpetual Peace, which was a philosophical dream if ever there was one, and which for centuries after it was published was seen as a kind of crazy fantasy. And I think Kant himself was aware of how it would have been, and it was indeed perceived in that way. And yet, after the Second World War, the conditions were there for the creation of a European Union that in almost every major respect is the living political institutional embodiment of that philosophical dream that Kant put forward all those centuries before. So by all means dream, by all means remember, but have it supported and undergirded by honest, rigorous, detailed thought.
Thank you for joining us. We hope today's presentation can contribute to the building of a more peaceful and positive future.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.